it just seems like we're approaching problems and approaching the organization the same way. And I've just seen this, even with microservices. People talk about, consolidating things, making them smaller, and I just see people writing these huge microservices. Like, what are we doing? Can we do things better? So I started to wonder, what if I started to look at different structures of systems? For example, what if something in chaotic systems might be able to help us, and how they might be organized, and some of the patterns that are revealed in those. And this is a lovely picture of the Orion Nebula. A little thing about art. Paul Cézanne, the French post-impressionist painter, is quoted as saying, "We live in a rainbow of chaos." In his paintings, he eventually began to, regardless of how everyone around him was seeing and interpreting things, he eventually started to structurally order what he saw around him into what he was producing. And he tried to simplify forms and the planes of color. And this reinterpretation that he did eventually became a bridge between Impressionism and Cubism, which sparked one of the most revolutionary areas of artistic inquiry in the 20th century. And I thought that was a really good way to open this talk. And here's a picture of the trapezium cluster in the Orion Nebula. And this is how we saw it for a long time using the Hubble telescope. And I keep wanting to say this looks really nebular, but that's probably wrong. But new ways of translating what we can see really can change everything for us. And something that once looked chaotic, for example here, using the VISTA infrared telescope, a new tool that was developed, reveals that there are actually very active young stars in the deeper dusty regions of this cluster. So it looks chaotic, but just a different way of viewing it. We can see these fascinating structures and all this new activity going on. And then there's all this order and all these processes happening underneath it that we didn't know about before. Again, the Orion Nebula, but here, you see a pattern out in space. And that same pattern reflected back on Earth, which I think is really fascinating. So with growing insight, we recognize more patterns at all levels of scale. And that's the really important thing, I think. Learning patterns is something that humans are uniquely good at. But getting a machine to discover new patterns that evolve over time is completely different. Generally, with something like machine learning, we're giving them templates that they can learn from, things that are existing patterns. So what comes easily to something like a scallop is really a challenge for some of the world's largest supercomputers in pattern recognition. And with chaos, it's unfortunate that we use the word chaos to describe it, because in the language, the word chaos suggests complete disorder. And chaos is really the study of order within a system that exhibits apparent randomness. And the key there is apparent randomness. And what these systems have is a sensitivity to initial conditions. And if you're familiar, if you've heard of the butterfly effect, where a small change in one state of a deterministic nonlinear system, which these are, can result in large-scale differences at a later state. And this really also touches on the evolution of systems. So chaos theory focuses on discovering the underlying patterns in these turbulent processes or erratic behaviors or seemingly random data, which I think is something that we all deal with. I know I've dealt with this like my whole career. And don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about chaos engineering. So this underlying order gets us closer to being able to predict and control chaotic systems. And this really has widespread application for us in every single domain that we deal with. And then we might be able to apply this to problems such as climate change, dealing with world hunger, and many, many other problems. So we can ask the question of our systems, does something which appears chaotic or disordered exhibit something recognizable with some kind of regularity in a stream of time that we can observe? And patterns are ubiquitous. We see them everywhere. And pattern formation is pervasive. In the patterns that we design, we talk about patterns in software engineering or in how we organize our systems, in finding patterns recognized in our data sets. It's everywhere. Things done in a patternistic way. And what's really interesting is when we start to look at pattern formation, what do these patterns have in common? And this is, to me, really fascinating. They are all ways to formulate structures that are conduits for energy. And you see this in biological systems. You see this when we're structuring massive data streaming, terabytes of data. Cells do it, everything does it. This notion of conduits for energy is a foundational theme in all of these systems. So why do we care about this in massively scalable systems when we're dealing with streaming terabytes of data per day through clusters of nodes across globally networked replicated systems? Well, when we think about this, the ways that we design these systems becomes vital, in order for them to be resilient. And there's this prevailing phenomenon of self-organization, which I think is also fascinating, where a system will spontaneously become ordered in space and time from local interactions of all of the members or all of the units of these systems that are networked together. And self-organization theory grew out of many different areas of study: computer science, economics, biology. And these processes are found throughout in astrophysics, in atomic physics, cell biology, evolutionary biology, and genetics, and many, many others. So complex, sorry, I don't want to talk about that. And one thing that I think is really important that we don't so much talk about in the business sector of technology is data lineage. And I really like this quote: "Any living cell carries with it the experience of 1 billion years of experimentation." And we try and come up with these new ideas, and really there's this whole tremendous data lineage that's been happening before us that have patterns that have been evolving through things like natural selection and creating optimized solutions for things that really we don't look at in our sector of the industry. So I'd like us to start looking at pattern formation through the lens of biological systems and see what we might be able to start applying. Because living systems have tremendous data lineage. Atoms self-organize, protein molecules self-organize. In this picture is a cell with handling the response to heat shock and what happens with protein molecules when they start to self-organize. And note that nothing is telling them to do that. There's no controlling factor. There's no leader that says, okay guys, this is what we're going to start doing now. They regulate, they optimize, replicate, and have been doing this for over millions of years. And I like this quote: "We live in a world which is constantly exploring what's possible, finding new combinations, not struggling to survive, but playing, tinkering to find what's possible." And really that's what we're doing, but without the deadlines that we actually have. And we are part of the experimenting, if you think about it. So for situations where we don't have the right algorithms yet for what we are trying to solve, we can start to look at how nature solved that problem. And self-organization is a really fascinating aspect of how chaotic systems and nonlinear systems, deterministic systems behave, and complex adaptive systems. Again, it's this phenomenon of self-organization. Of all the distinctive traits of this collective behavior, the most spectacular is this emergence of group order, where individuals within the group or entities spontaneously, without any global control, synchronize their behavioral state with each other. So this is just a quick little animated GIF of penguins in Antarctica in the Antarctic winter, and I think that they are king penguins, emperor penguins, sorry. and them huddling together. Yeah. So this is really fascinating, and you should check out, if you're interested, PBS, the Nature program, The Gathering Swarms. There is no leader in these penguin groups, in these little societies. They have needed to solve a problem in their particular, environment that they're deployed into. And over the years, they had to deal with changing environmental systems. And what they've learned to do without discussing it, they're very chatty if you've ever seen a penguin colony. But they, in order to conserve heat, they will rotate among themselves. The individuals will rotate towards the center, and the ones in the center will slowly, once they're warm enough, rotate out. And then what happens even is the ones that have been on the outside, if they get really, really cold, because it's like 70 below, they will spawn off into a new group, where the ones that were inside the other group will start to be on the outside, and they rotate around. And this is self-organization. No one's coordinating this. We start to see patterns of order from disorder, where 1 million birds in a chaotic array will spontaneously assemble and appear to act and think with one mind. And the knowledge of each of these individuals adds together and helps the system make decisions to come to a consensus, which I'm going to get into, and find resources and fend off threats. And this is, again, stuff that we all deal with our systems that we write and deploy. This is migrating geese, and contrary to what you might think, there's no leader here. The one in the front feels the drag of the wind, and when it gets tired, it will just on its own sort of move to the back, and another one that's fresher will go to the front. And they do this because they've learned to optimize energy conservation. And the roles in these groups are totally fluid, and that is part of the strategy that they've evolved for resilience. I am going to get into this significantly because it deals with computations that when we're dealing with big data processing that we do. So for over 130 million years of evolution-tuned optimization algorithms across hundreds of thousands of species, everything has been tuned to something specific. Ants alone comprise more than 14,000 species on the planet, and they live in every habitat dealing with every type of ecological problem that we could think of. And they've evolved solutions for those. Some of them are solutions that we haven't even thought up, and some of them are actually protocols that we've developed that are incredibly similar, where we developed them relatively recently, but they've developed them millions of years ago. And I think that by looking at this, we can apply those to the systems that we're engineering. Schooling and synchrony, the largest fish migration on the planet happens along the coast of South Africa. And these are sardines. Just the sheer oneness of it, if you've ever seen them, where all of a sudden the group is going one way, and then in a second, they all move together as one, as individuals, but they become a single entity with a single collective mind making decisions. And how do they do this? They have a feedback machine. I'm going to go into a little bit about that, that allows each of these unique individuals to assess constantly changing input and reapply simple rules to make decisions. And swarming, when you consider a swarm one bee at a time, one unit at a time, it starts to look just like a complete heap of chaos. If you've ever seen bees flying around, it just looks a little bit crazy and random. Each insect wanders around using its tiny brain, and they perceive nothing more than its immediate surroundings. There's no notion of what's going on in the whole of the swarm. Yet somehow, thousands make a collective decision. And you can put these all under the umbrella of superorganisms. When entities assemble, something extraordinary happens. And like our engineered systems, they're all dealing with constant threats, fluctuating resources, and changing environmental factors, but superorganisms work collectively to solve them. So how do groups of unique, error-prone actors succeed and fail at processing information together? And what's interesting is that when you start to look at these systems of simple actors and collective intelligence, it's incredibly, if not exactly similar to how neurons work in the brain. A superorganism behavior may not be consciousness in the whole, but may be described as that because they start to work as one. And I really love this quote by Walter J. Freeman III. Perception requires the mass action of thousands to millions of neurons. And the reason that this really speaks to me, because I work on systems at massive scale, and there's, problems become exponentially larger. And I'm not going to get into neural systems. The problem with this talk is that there's so many different topics and there's so many different trajectories that we could talk about. We would really need a week to cover it all. So the human brain contains roughly 100 billion neurons, and each one connects to thousands of other neurons. And there are over 100 trillion connections in our brain. So activities like thinking or remembering are the result of countless electrical interactions. So this really makes our brain the ultimate collective. Neurons fire signals that only collectively create what we call intelligence. So just like our systems that we build with hundreds of ingestion nodes collecting, terabytes of data across innumerable instances, clusters, and data centers, nothing really starts to make sense until we pull it together in some kind of analysis of what this actually means, given some framework of time and location, and then we could start to extract behaviors from that. Individual members of a swarm behave surprisingly like neurons in the brain. And of course, this is what we deal with in distributed computations. And this is not happening through any global control or distributed kind of query, where in a distributed query, I might be sending out a command and say, this is what I want to know. And I'm doing some kind of possibly hashed routing to where this data lives. And I want to get, as fast as I can, some specific information, pull it together, analyze it, and return some kind of intelligence about that. What does that actually mean? But simple distributed autonomous agents with innate rules are doing this. And this is fascinating. And I want to talk a little bit about swarm intelligence. This is not exactly something that we can apply to when you're writing applications and deploying them, because there's a lot of logic in there. But it can apply to the organization of these systems. And that's what I think is really important. And it can absolutely apply to any kind of massive scale compute that we're doing for any of us that do that kind of work. So swarm intelligence is really doing this, it's solving this. But I noticed that, and I really noticed this, swarm is highly misunderstood in the business sector when people are really just marketing things, tagging it as like, oh, this is swarm, and then underneath, it's actually raft, and they're doing leader election, and this is not what swarm intelligence is about organizationally. Every single implementation I've seen. And there's this convergence between neurons, bees, ants, and many different types of collective organizations that can teach us about how we design networks, clusters, network logic, as well as designing intelligent swarms ourselves. So how do real swarms do this? And I'm going to talk first a bit about theory and the properties of these, and then I want to get into some specific examples so you can sort of hang context onto all of this and start to think about how you might be able to do some kind of takeaway for yourself in the work that you do. So this talk is really focusing on self-organized systems in the whole chain of complex systems and non-determinism, et cetera. And there are many autonomous entities that will self-assemble into emergent patterns specifically to solve problems. And that's why I wanted to tag this with a biological spin, because over time, that's what they're doing. They're experimenting, they're evolving, and we really can take advantage of that. And they're doing all of this with no global coordination at all. And these global level patterns that emerge are unpredictable from the behaviors of each of the units. So if you look at the simplicity of what each of these individual agents are doing and all the constraints that they have, you can never, looking at that, glean from that what the group as a whole in these emergent patterns of self-organization and self-assembly are going to do. And that's where it's really interesting. And this emerges solely from these numerous interactions between the individuals. And swarm intelligence is really a perfect example of this. So we have autonomy. Many different agents network together. It's simplistic. I'm going to get into that in a second. Decentralization, which I'm also going to talk about. No leader, no supervisor, no global coordination. Spontaneous self-assembly for order, where previously they're networked, they're communicating like crazy, but there's no implicit organization that happens until they spontaneously do this. There's some kind of trigger. And then system-level patterns unpredictable to looking at the units themselves, and then an eventual group intelligence and capabilities that we get from these systems that far exceed the capability of the individuals. So decentralization, we hear this a lot, particularly with things like blockchain. Decentralization, when we talk about it, it's a lot of what I see people and hear people are really misunderstanding decentralization because they want to throw, some kind of leader or something that's organizing underneath all of it. And it's one of the organizational undercurrents inherent to self-organized systems, one of the most important building blocks of collective intelligence, and the least understood. And it's been evolving for millions of years. This is not some new thing that we've recently thought about from various sectors. So instead of being tied to some kind of master clock or leader, each node, each simplified unit acts independently. And there's a way that a whole other system, and at a different scale, and this is why I wanted to show the Orion Nebula with this pattern of a spiral. And back on Earth, there's this spiral pattern in a Nautilus shell. And if you're familiar, I don't know if any of you are math people, the concept of fractals and chaos really ties in here. And we see a big organizational difference when we think of even our teams, our companies, and how they're organized, where even on small teams and orgs within companies, in one area, you'll know about something, you'll know what's going on, you'll know what the constraints are, whereas another team you work with, they might know, or you might have a manager that's managing multiple teams, and it's really only the people on those teams that know exactly what's going on in those situations. So the concept of everything bubbling up to some kind of coordinator or leader, it actually takes a lot of energy to do this, and you have to question the accuracy of it. So when information is very distributed across an org, does it really make sense to have power so concentrated? And in these systems, there's no one in charge. And again, you see this from neurons in the brain, bees in hives, it's all over the place. Cells in the body, cells organizing into organisms themselves. And there's no notion. Someone recently, I won't say who, asked me about isn't this kind of like Akko? But it's really not. There's no notion of membership in a local group. There's nothing managing when nodes join or leave. There's no common bootstrap that's happening in these systems. A group can form with a minimum number of members, which, for example, Akko Cluster has. But entities can just spawn off at any time and start their own, which they do for specific reasons as conditions change. And there's no notion of an elect event with regard to a leader. But individuals do vote, which I'm going to talk about, with regard to consensus and decide on ideas. And the root organization of this is an autonomous agent or a compute agent, which I'm going to talk about too. So everything from air molecules and weather systems to bees in a swarm, hundreds of thousands of entities with the absolute freedom to make any number of choices about what they perceive, what is reality, what they've gone off and discovered, and where to go next at any given moment, making incredibly fast decisions and communicating them to their local sphere. They're not distributing that information or reporting it up to something that's collecting it. But autonomous agents don't exist in pure chaos. Behavior is really governed by applying simple rules as necessary, and very often they apply simple rules and do this iteratively until some process has been completed. And these are very, very chatty networks. These are simple organisms. They're constantly needing to talk to each other. For example, with fish, they need to talk to each other and communicate through signals. I need to move really quickly. I don't want to get too close to you. Or ants, I want to, go in a certain direction. There's something over here. Where are we seeing this? I need to make a decision very quickly. And it really strikes me as something that's kind of like contagion theory, information spreading from node to node virally, because it all happens very fast, rippling through the group. So how does something that spreads or doesn't spread over hundreds to thousands of unique nodes happen? And these are not clones. I think that's important to specify that. These are all unique entities together. Nothing is broadcast to all nodes. It's a very quick sort of meta signal through the graph. And if one of the signals is dropped, it's fine. Nothing is lost. And I'm going to get a bit into not quite fault tolerance, but resilience in these systems. So there's the notion of how infectious is this given phenomena that spreads through our network, and the topology, and how these elements are assessing the topology and where they fit in it and how they can leverage it. And what they're doing is regular continual interactions and computation, again, very, very noisy networks, amplification when there's something to discuss or something to distribute to its nearest neighbor or peers, and then eventually what happens when they go through the process of consensus on something, they're as a collectively trying to decide, there's this amazing eventual synchronization of state, which I find fascinating because, again, there's no control. So swarm algorithms are really interesting. Swarm intelligence algorithms, the strategies have some similar properties, and they have to be distributed, which really applies to the work that we do. They have to be decentralized in order to function properly and be incredibly fast and fault tolerant. They are adaptive, which I think is something that is sadly missing in the systems that we're designing. I mean, we talk about machine learning, we talk about analytics and getting information from things and reporting, monitoring, but I have noticed in the last 10 years, and I haven't had any time to work on this, but someone should, that some kind of kernel of intelligence, some kind of learning about in the infrastructure layer, no matter what the domain is, needs to have some of these properties. I'm going to highlight what some of these properties are as I hit them in the talk. But some of the detailed examples, I list just a few of some of the higher level swarm algorithms, but these are really fascinating, and there's like hundreds of these. If you read the papers, and I think I read like 100 scientific papers on a lot of this information in like the last couple months. It's incredible. So things I just want to call out, because I think a lot of you working in big data or otherwise, or if you have a math or physics background, these will resonate for you. Like particle swarm optimization. This is inspired with regard to swarm intelligence and swarm algorithms by flocking behaviors, schooling behaviors, and herding. Ants, there's so many different kind of strategies that ants can teach us. The primary one that we get from them is various kinds of optimization, and that's search, distributed search, finding good paths, intelligent routing through systems, working through graphs, distributed graphs. Bees for optimizing in continuous multivariate functions. They are incredibly used towards robotics, distributed robotics solutions, networks, vehicle routing, image analysis, data mining, genetic algorithms, and training of artificial neural networks. So, I mean, and this is just really only some. So when many of the relevant algorithm results were compared, and this is interesting, results showed that with this, it's the ABC algorithm, the artificial bee colony, there were several different that were related, and when they were all compared on which ones were the most efficient, the scientific results showed that the ABC outperformed all the other algorithms. And you really see this. People are really finding this all across this domain. And so we can really start to look at those and apply them to these systems that we're building and how we're constructing our networks and our clusters, even our applications. It's really fascinating. So what actually is a computational agent? I think I talked about autonomous agents, but there's another more specified level to that. And all of these, again, are very similar between computational agents when we think about neurons, the behavior of bees, the behavior of ants. And they are simple networked entities which collectively have been solving problems of distribution for millions of years. And this is another thing, like, why aren't we looking at these in our sector of the industry more? Computationally speaking, though, each agent has very limited capabilities, and they lack the capacity alone to make the kind of decisions that need to be made for survivability in their environments. But when they come together, they self-organize, they make decisions, and that's when everything comes together for them to make complex decisions for the group. So I'm going to read this slide. They have limited capabilities and intelligence governed by a very simple set of rules. And these are the rules that give them the criteria in which they decide things with. And it's been observed, but not proved yet, that these criteria might be weighted, that they have priorities. And they share information with their nearest neighbor. They're not reporting up to someone. And they communicate very often and only through incredibly brief, efficient interactions. Need some water, guys, sorry. So these are basically computers embedded in nature. And, incredible survivability all through working through what they've learned through evolution, trial and error, experimentation. So for around 130 million years, evolution has tuned ant and bee colony algorithms to near optimal efficiency. And that sort of begs the question to us, what have they optimized for in all this time? And if you think about it, this is a very applicable quote. Our computers are electricity-guzzling machines. The bee, however, is doing fairly high-level cognitive tasks with a tiny drop of nectar. And their brains are probably processing information in a very clever way. And there's definitely things that we can learn and how to even construct the computers that we use based on looking at these simple systems that work together in a network. So can destructing how the bees compute help design more efficient computers? And the organization of the bee, colonies are composed of a queen and several thousand workers. And really, the queen does not make decisions for the hive at all. The hive is always making decisions for her. And it's remarkable that all of these tasks do not depend in any way on any kind of central control, but they're achieved only by using these principles of self-organization. And some of the things that they do are maintaining constant temperature in their hive, which just sounds incredible given that they're bees. Keeping track of changing foraging conditions, and ants do these as well, and selecting the best possible nest site, which I am going to explain. And selecting the best possible nest site, this is really a life or death situation for bees. When they need to leave their hive, usually it's because, incredible degradation. They really only have somewhere around 3 days to find a new nest site before they die. So over time, they become incredibly efficient at how they go, the algorithms behind how they go about their search for this, and then how these simple organisms go about deciding together what to do next. So scout bees make up about 3% of the population of a single hive. And there might be around 50 scouts that fly off in all directions, several different miles sometimes, depending, up to several kilometers to search for candidate locations. And when a scout finds one, and again, they have specific criteria they're looking for, size of it, is there anything around it, how can they handle any kind of threats. There's actually quite a big list of what they need to look for in a candidate nest. They will go out and then they will return if they've found something they think is a viable solution. And really the cool thing about what they do is they don't, and this has been incredibly researched, I'm not surmising it, although it sounds like I am. They don't propose it as though the way that humans would do. Like if you think about the last couple meetings you had with your team, or with cross with another team when you're discussing what to do. What the bees will do is they'll gather information on something, come back to the collective, and they'll say, well, I found out this thing. I think it might be a good idea, but they're not attached to it. They're not trying to impose it on anyone, and they're just doing it very collectively, trying to just sort of amass this information with which all of them, without any leader, can make a decision about. And so they communicate the potential site information through visual signals. And they do this through, it's kind of a funny name, it's called the waggle dance. Their body sort of wiggles around, and this allows them, in this dance that they do, they encode a lot of the information about what they've found and how to recruit other bees, other scouts, to possibly go check this out. And they do this kind of figure eight, where they go around, and then as they come back into the center of this figure eight pattern, that's when they do this sort of waggle dance aspect. And what they do is encode into that the direction and the distance to that site, and the duration that they do this dance directly correlates to how excited they are about this possible solution. Like, how viable they think this might be for the group. And it's only seen, it's not like they're in some theater where everyone's watching them and getting this information together. It's really just, they come back, they land, they do their little dance, and it's only the ones that are around them, and they're doing, and the thing is, if you look at videos of how it's been researched, there might be 10 or 20 potential sites that come back, and they're all, several dances are going on by scout bees, and they need to sort of correlate all of this in their brain of these very simple individuals. It's fascinating. And I have a video. So decisions are faster, and this pertains across the board, not just bees. Decisions have been found to be faster when choices are of higher quality. And this happens in our brains as well. So besides distance and directions to a resource, the bee is encoding its quality as a weighted factor based on the criteria, and the duration depends on how enthusiastic they are. So within seconds after reaching the group consensus, and they tend to have what's been found to be a quorum of roughly, depending of course on the size of the hive, how many entities are in this system, 15 to 30 need to agree before they will just say, okay, closing up shop, we're going to, everyone get ready to fly. They don't proceed anymore. They just say the first one wins that meets this quorum threshold, and then they take off. Because they've got to do this all very quickly. It's incredibly important to them. So this is what the waggle dance looks like. And I picked one that kind of was slowed down so you could sort of see this guy going in the figure eight, doing the waggle dance, and the direction that they're going is pointing to the particular available resource. So ants and algorithms have to be simple, distributed, and scalable, the very qualities that we need in a large engineered system. And this is a quote by Deborah Gordon, who's a really famous biologist at Stanford, And she's been studying ant populations around the world for, I don't know, 30 years. She has several TED Talks that I really recommend if you're interested in how things organize. And really, when you start by looking at organization, by looking at bees, you're starting at the beginning of evolution because ants have been around for so long. And ants use algorithms that humans began using relatively recently. Only the ants have been using them for millions of years. And ant colony optimization algorithms have been applied to many, many combinatorial optimization problems, from quadratic assignment to congestion minimization or routing of vehicles. And it has also been used to produce near-optimal solutions for the traveling salesman problem. And this is something that when people talk about ant optimization, they really talk about the TSP very often. So what do you think? What is this? Chaos or pattern? It kind of looks chaotic. If you were to listen to the sound of an ant colony going about its daily movements in their colony, or if you can see the map movements over time by video or even hear them, people have recorded the sound of ants moving around their colony with tiny, tiny recorders collecting the sound. It really does sound very chaotic. And the world's largest ant colony stretches over 2.7 kilometers, 670 acres, and contains approximately 306 million workers with 1 million queens across 45,000 interconnected nests. And this is an example of what a superorganism is, or a super colony. So you can really think about this as 307 million nodes, 45,000 deployed clusters, 1 million replicators, not replicants, but units able to replicate clusters. These are very massive systems at scale. Such super colonies succeed in part, this is very important, because no one is in charge. And members communicate in these systems through algorithmic patterns which help them survive as a whole. And what they're actually doing is, this image is just a snapshot from a video of seeing ants moving their army ants. So again, every species of ants in every different environment is solving different problems. And this is congestion avoidance optimization, where army ants have evolved a 3-lane traffic system. Mathematics simulations show that the pattern minimizes congestion and maximizes flow of the resource to storage and utilization. And these traffic systems achieve a max flow of 200,000 outbound in the stream and can return carrying an additional 30,000 units of cargo a day. And I don't know if you've ever seen a video of ants. Ants are really strong for their size, and they will often carry a load. This makes me think of data loads and the size of packets and all of the chaos that comes from that we deal with. It's n times larger than their actual body. Hundreds of thousands of travelers speed along densely packed highways, because that's what they actually create, are these transportation highways with huge loads, but without congestion. And if you think about a lot of the traffic patterns in areas of the world, human traffic patterns, we have a lot of congestion all the time, and they do not. So how do they exchange information to make decisions? Well, colonies of ants have sterile female workers, one or more reproductive females, and males that simply mate with future queens and die soon after. And in most species, a lot of the ants can barely see. They operate mostly by smell. So a meeting for an ant, unlike our meetings, is just a quick touch of the antenna so they can smell. They leave pheromones, which are not long-lived, so that the information that you glean from gathering the pheromone, it's not something that's going to have a lot of latency. It's going to be pretty recent information. And they do this to identify who is my nestmate and what have you been recently doing. And so each ant just has to keep track of its recent experience to decide what to do next. And one algorithm that we work with, which was invented in the early stages of the internet that we all use, because operating costs were high. And its goal was managing data congestion by gauging bandwidth availability. And this is really similar to one that evolved by desert ants to gauge resource scarcity millions of years ago. Foraging strategy of harvester ants evolved an algorithm to conserve water in the desert. They have to spend it to get it. So when the most precious resource is scarce, the algorithm that regulates flow evolved towards minimizing operating costs rather than maximizing current accumulation of that resource. And they collectively somehow regulate the trade-off between spending that resource in order to get more. And colonies do this. They have been shown, the colonies that do this strategy have been shown in many, many studies to be much more successful. And this is definitely something that's a sustainable strategy that for any system where it's essential to achieve long-term reliability and avoid wasted time and resources, energy that they can use themselves. And I want to read this just really quick. So when an ant forages in the sun, it loses water and it gets back the water from that resource that it's going to get. And the would-be foragers wait at a narrow entrance to the tunnel. And when a returning, only one ant that's been out foraging that successfully returns, sort of part of the positive feedback loop of that, it will drop the load and briefly touch some of the ants around it to let them know, I was out doing this task and this has been successful. And there's a reason why all they pay attention to is the rate. They don't pay attention to, as bees would, the location of these resources. So the search pattern optimization is quite different. So when one ant meets another, it doesn't matter which ant it meets. There's no ordering in these systems that quite matters. They're not transmitting any kind of complicated signal to each other. The only thing that matters is the rate of the interactions, the positive feedback. And they didn't just solve distributed search, they optimized it. So there's something to be learned about very large dynamical systems that we engineer by focusing on the patterns and interactions rather than the content. TCP, so obviously that's what I was talking about, that we developed recently, but the ants had evolved something very similar to this millions of years ago. So what a forager will do for that initial three-way handshake is this simple feedback system. And again, just as a neuron will add up its stimulation from other neurons to decide whether to fire, each ant adds up its positive feedback from interactions to decide whether or not to go out and forage. And it has, this is a theme, they have some kind of quorum number that they, if you have a certain amount of positive feedback interactions, then they will go forth and do a particular task. TCP slow start, gauging bandwidth and elastic scaling. So a source sends out a large wave packet, and in the beginning, to gauge the bandwidth, and foraging ants, send out a scout to gauge food availability before they go and auto-scale up or down with the rate of outgoing foragers. And in timeout, an ant doesn't leave the nest until it's met enough ants returning with food. So once it's out, a forager won't return until it collects some food, and the system will stay stopped unless something positive happens in the system. And I want to talk a little bit about smart swarms. Again, we could probably spend all day on this. It's kind of frustrating doing this talk because I kept going down these avenues that were like, oh, that's so cool. And then, originally this talk was like 100 slides. Now it's 50. So with smart swarms, that's exactly what we've been doing. The ability to create and program large autonomous swarms which can achieve complex global behavior from cooperation of many limited and noisy individuals. And in Harvard, I can't remember the name of the lab, they are doing a lot of distributed robotics research. Just as trillions of individual cells can assemble into intelligent organisms, their developed kilobot swarm demonstrates how complex group behaviors can arise from simple units. So instead of the concept, when we think of robots, we think of one highly complex robots. What they are doing in this type of research is thousands of machines that collaborate, providing a simple platform creating and testing these complex behaviors. And the value of that is, of course, so that we can take these tests and try and push how we can develop them and our understanding of them. So the question then for AI becomes, what are the rules of engagement that lead to this kind of intelligence? And these are the kilobots. What does that remind you of? The penguins? So what they had to do, if you think about it, they had to program all of these things. And this is just the movement. There are some of them that have a program to build. And you think that it's going to be really easy, but actually it's been very hard for the researchers to program for this swarm. If you're dealing with like 1 or 10, but when it becomes an incredibly different problem when you've got, I think now they have a swarm of 1,024 kilobots together working as an artificial colony. So you can program what it does. It also needs to be able to communicate to its nearest neighbors, understand its relationship and current place in its local node topology. You can program what its rules of engagement are with other elements. They need to be able to understand and execute spontaneous synchronization, some kind of contagion in their behavior. Not one of them is doing any specific goal perfectly well, which sort of takes the pressure off, but together, collaboratively, the group is able to do something much more significant. And I think originally it was really hard for them to get started with the project because of, they were very expensive to build initially. But the beauty of biological systems, this is a quote from the lead professor over this project at, here it is, Harvard University's Weiss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. If you're not familiar with them, definitely check them out. Very, very cool stuff happening. You stop noticing what the individuals are doing in systems like this, and you start to only see the whole. So in terms of scalability, if every agent is following the same set of rules, which is what everything I've been talking about is doing, your code that runs in these systems is exactly the same whether you have 10 or 10,000 agents. But there are definitely some roadblocks that they ran into. It represents what they're doing, a significant milestone in the development of collective artificial intelligence, because previous algorithmic limitations coordinating such large numbers, previously they had been, maybe groups had gotten like 100 swarm of robots, different kinds of robots. But this is the first one that was actually successfully able to get over 1,000. And they overcame the limitations they finally realized what it was that they could tweak in the algorithm in their design. And what they did was requiring no micromanagement, no intervention once the initial set of instructions was delivered. And so that decentralization was the pin that allowed them to go forward with this type of design. And I think that's really critical. And this was what allowed thousands of robots to perform in synchrony. What do you guys see in that? I had to add a little lambda on there, on that little bot. So AI algorithms at scale, obviously increasingly we're going to see more of these, and everyone's talking about self-driving cars, but I think we're going to see larger numbers of simpler robots working together at massive scale, whether it's hundreds cooperating to achieve some kind of environmental cleanup, or quick disaster response, or millions of self-driving cars on the highway. The thing that we can learn from that is understanding, while we're studying these systems, how to design good systems at scale. And so for now, the kilobots provide that really nice test bed for AI algorithms. So how do we find, with all of this information, the signals in the noise? And this is, I love this quote by E.O. Wilson, who is a biological ant researcher, very famous. "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom." And chaos theory has proven that there is order within systems where we had assumed were random and chaotic. And this leads us to discover more patterns within these systems and how far humans can grasp for hidden order and chaotic events. But it's not a simple leap from knowing that there may be a pattern to actually being able to discover what that pattern is in the chaos. And some of the stuff to consolidate what I've talked about: flexible roles, decentralization, no leader, no reporting to one particular unit, nothing knows everything that's going on, distributed consensus, simple rules and instructions for the agents, local interactions and feedback loops, self-organizing, and super coordinators. And just two more things I have to mention about reliability and resilience in these systems. We all are searching for ways to ensure reliability in our networks at scale. And system resilience is a function of decentralization. And decentralized systems are more inexpensive to attack. Overly engineered systems that are primarily what I see deployed out into the systems for every company I've worked at. They might seem like what we would call an elegant system. They might seem like a good idea, but the robustness of a swarm algorithm shows that tolerating imperfection can overall lead to better solutions without attempting to set up any kind of central authority that regulates the events. And a single neuron is like a bee or a scout. The capacity of the collectives to learn is very quick. There's strategies that allow them to move through roadblocks when they encounter them, or be able to rapidly exploit some of the decisions that they need to make. And we're going to end with this really awesome quote by Buckminster Fuller: "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And if you have any questions, please come find me. I'll be around all day today. Follow me on Twitter. And unfortunately, my resources page would have been, massive. So I only put what would, kind of fit in there. I am going to post this on SlideShare and I'll tweet it. But thank you so much for listening.